It's a very long title. So it's my turn to thank the organizer for this wonderful 3 days. So what I will show you today is part of my latest textual experiment, so to speak. And okay. So as you of course know, in many cases, the first means of diffusion of new mathematical knowledge is the written text. And of course, these texts are the result of a fairly long process. And this process is often completely invisible to readers. And the published text is just like the front window of mathematics. And what I want to do today is to look at some parts of mathematics well, sure. C'est dans ma bouche. C'est mieux. So look at some parts of mathematics which are private, so the drafts of the mathematician. And in the draft, we see some parts of the mathematics that are completely erased from publication, and this is what I want to look at. So of course, that suppose that we reject the divide between the contents of scientific text and the materiality of the text. So to illustrate this, I will use some of Richard Dedekind's style, and I want to focus on a very specific part of his writing, namely the steps of writing a rigorous, readable, and maybe eventually publishable text. And it's only a very small part of the research creative process in mathematics. And so I want to take you on a small part of the journey of Dedekind's journey on that aspect. So, as some of you may know, Richard Dedekind was a German mathematician from the second half of the 19th century. He worked mainly in number theory, algebra, and the foundation of mathematics. The book I will focus on today, Zahlen und Sollen, was published in 1988. And in this book, Dedekind wants to provide a general, rigorous definition for the sequence of natural numbers. He defines an abstract concept named simply infinite system, of which the sequence of natural number is an instance. And to do so, he developed a set theoretical arsenal based on 2 concepts, the mapping, Abbildung. You have the definition here because I will talk about it a lot. It's basically like a function. And the sets, which he calls systems. So a lot has been said about this part of Dedekind's works, including using the draft of Zahlen und Sollen in Dirk Schlimm's and Wilfried Sieg's papers. And my goal is not to offer some strikingly new insight on Dedekind's concept of number, but to look at the genesis of the text itself, at the process of writing. So as I said, I will focus on the concept of mapping, which appears fairly early in the text and does not require too much context or too much knowledge of mathematics. And the last part of context I want to give you is a few words on Dedekind and rigor. So Zahlen und Sollen is often thought of as an illustration or even a sort of realization of Dedekind's ideal of rigor. It's called for a greater rigor in mathematics and in particular in the foundation of mathematics. And so for Dedekind, to give a rigorous foundation meant the following. First, you have to proceed to a conceptual analysis. So here are the sequence of natural numbers in order to identify its fundamental properties. Then you identify the right order of definitions and proof to run the concept in questions. So for example, Dedekind defined what it meant to be infinite for a system before it defined the sequence of natural numbers. Thirdly, you have to provide definitions and proof based on the conceptual analysis and relying on the earlier fundamental concept that you identified. So here, that's the sets and the mappings. And finally, you have to use the tools introduced to redefine notions and to reprove results. So for example, redefine the arithmetical operation and improve the property. So what is central for the Dedekindian reader is the organization of the conceptual architecture, the justificative order, which provide a sort of framework in which to develop definitions and proof. Okay. So what I want to do is to sort of understand the shaping of Basel and Zahlen and how rigor and the fine-tuning of the deductive order are put into play, and I will do so with two scales of observation. So the draft, you have here the reference for the draft of Basel and Zahlen. We have several of them. One is a set of drafts from the 70s. You see here the very first page, and it has a layout that Dedekind uses a lot when he writes a fully written text, redaction, with a left column for the main text and the right column for the corrections, additions, and so on. So you see already here corrections. And then we have drafts from the 80s. So that's the first page too. And we have the same layout, and you see the correction and some reflection on notations, which sign wants to use and so on. So I will start with the text from the 70s. So the first set of manuscripts from the 70s is a little bit complex because there are three texts that are sort of layers, which are following, completing, and correcting each other. And so the three together do not make a coherent whole. There are repetitions and gaps. So what you see here is something I did for myself to understand the differences of structure between each text. So on the far left, you have the published draft, and then you have each draft from the 70s. So there are some difference in wording, but the idea is that the same color means that it's more or less the same conceptual content, and the sort of texture in red means that it was deleted in the later versions. So it was a little strange, for example, that in the third draft, Dedekind did not define systems. So that's why there is a gap, because there is no definition. And I assume that it was because he was just satisfied with the initial definition. So that's the beginning, then that's the rest of the. So if we take off the gaps, it's a little bit more readable. And you see with the color, we see already that the structure of the three drafts are very, very different, and it's quite different from the final version. So, I don't know, for example, the notion of mapping and similar mappings moves places quite a bit. And an important difference with the last version is that we don't have the abstract concept of simply infinite system. What is what?
Depend something to disappear.
That's because it was deleted later. It's deleted. It does not appear in the okay. Oh yes, dependence is a wait a minute. It's A is dependent of B if any chain that contains A also contains B.
Okay.
Okay, so the structure is really not fixed at this point, but the main idea, which is to use sets and mappings to define the set of natural numbers, is here. And the main difference is, of course, to the last version. So this was a very bird's-eye view. I will give you a little insight of the text with the concept of Abbildung. So it's quite an important concept in Dedekind's mathematics. He used it in many areas of his works, and it has a lot of transformations throughout Dedekind's work in number theory, in function theory, in fact theory, etc. It's not the purpose of my talk to analyze the conceptual changes of the concept of Abbildung. I just want to look at the definition at its place in the definition in the various version of 13.7. So here is a translation of the text. So that's the very first 72 version. Dedekind does not actually define an Abbildung. It defines what it means for a system to be mappable into another system. And it's not a general notion of mappable, it's a distinctly mappable, which basically means that you can have a projection between the two systems. And then he has an addition in the right column, but because of the notation that he uses with the A, the bar and the phi, we know that it was written basically at the same moment than the same draft, the third, draft, because that's the only place where he uses this notation with a bar. So before we had the system, and after he defines infinite systems, and then he keeps working with properties of systems. So it's really, he's really focused on systems here. That's the second draft. In the second draft, there are actually no definition either of mappable system nor mappings. Probably Dedekind was satisfied with its first definition, and he corrected later than this. It does define the image set, you have it here, and there is a notion of distinct, so the German word is deutlich, mapping introduced kind of in the middle of the text. And the third draft, we have an actual definition of Abbildung, and a little later we have the deutlich Abbildung, so it's a translation. So the definition does not change very much. In fact, that's always the same definition of mapping. Then we have the definition of sets, the definition of a deutlich Abbildung, and then the definition of an infinite system and the mapping of S itself. So there is a lot of adjusting the definition of that. And now we have the mapping as a whole, a consistent whole in the text, which was not the case in the previous text. Okay, I will now move on to the next draft. So this is the table of contents of the next to last draft, which is the more interesting one. A lot more stuff happens in this version of the text and the published text. So you see, if you remember how different the 70s drafts were from the last, you can already see that this draft is very different from the first we saw. The structures in 87 and in 88 are quite similar. There is two important changes. And the most important one is that there is an entire paragraph missing, which is the one that Dedekind calls the paragraph on the class of simply infinite system, which is in fact the paragraph in which we have Dedekind's categoricity theorem. And this has in fact a lot of repercussion on the proofs that can be made. And the second main difference is in the paragraph on the number of elements of an infinite system, which contains both elements from the paragraph finite and infinite part of the sequence of number of n, and the definition of cardinal number. And the definition of cardinal number is put completely at the end in the published version. There is a lot of differences in the proofs of this paragraph compared to the 87 version. So let's look at it a little bit more in detail. So I'm still with my Abbildung. So that's just because, so that's the entire page. You're not supposed to be able to read it. The red part is the parts that Dedekind wrote first, at the definition of the Abbildung. Here you have the definition, always the same definition, with some reflection on what we would call the S, the antécédent, and some notes on the notation that we would use. Then we have here a series of properties on mappings with, in blue, some notes. So here are the translation. So the properties are fairly basic. You have the definition of an image, properties of inclusion, and then you have, nota bene, the converse is allowed only if it's a mapping such that we will call it distant Deutlich letters, and you have the same thing with 17. So there are small changes compared to the published version, but they are very, very small. So we know already that there will be an additional notion of Deutlich mapping. Then he wrote this part, which is the definition of a Deutlich mapping. So when you have two different origins, you have two images. And then there are three propositions, 15 star, 15 double star, and 7 star, which are in fact the nota bene that Dedekind was alluding to in the left column. So now the nota bene are obsolete, but Dedekind did not delete them. But with the numbers, we know that this should be integrated into the left column. And of course, the fact that there are 15 stars and so on tells us that it was written after the left column. After that, here we have some properties on Deutlich mapping. So we don't need to read them, but I just want you to remember that they are Deutlich. Then we have this addition. So one thing that tells us that it was written after the bottom part is that the text is a little pressed down, but more importantly, Dedekind tells us that he wants to change the word, and instead of using Deutlich, he wants to use English, so he goes from distant to similar. There is a little date in the margin, and he notes that it will be used later for the definition of an infinite system, which is similar to a proper part of it. And he also wants the part on similar mapping to be an independent paragraph. And then the last part are this proposition on similar mappings, and we know that it was added later because he uses the word English, not Deutlich. So what I want to understand is in what was this done all at once, and in fact it was probably not. First, but maybe not the most important argument, is that in the next paragraph, the third paragraph, Dedekind starts the numbers for the proposition at 18, so he did not take into account the 15 star and so on. In fact, probably he had not written the 15 star and so on when he started writing the third paragraph. So the paragraph itself does not contain anything on similar mapping, but the published version gives a definition of the mapping of a system into itself that mentions that the mapping can be similar or not similar. The first paragraph starts at 40, and if we look at the previous page, we see that Dedekind wrote proposition 36 and 3 additions, so 39 propositions. And so he seems to have taken into account the 4 additions that he made in this paragraph and with a numbering. But not the 15 star to 17 star. So probably it was written, the 15 star to 17 star were written only in the fourth paragraph, during the fourth paragraph. So here Dedekind defines an infinite system. He uses the word Deutlich, that's what I put in red. So we have a clue that Dedekind had not made any change of terminology at this point. So the last additions were not made yet. And that's the 5th paragraph. So you see there are a lot of corrections. That's the definition of the sequence of natural numbers. So we have a first definition that's very informal. You see it said, I choose an element of S which is not an equal. There is no definition of the simply infinite system. So I will not read it for the sake of time, I think. On the right side, there is a correction. Here is the translation. And here we have simply, oh, I forgot to say the important thing. It uses the word deutlich distinct here. So we still don't have the change of terminology. And here we have a simply infinite system, and we have the word ähnlich, similar mapping. Okay, I will not read it, but we can look at it later if you want. And if we look at the rest of the page, so we have here in the word deutlich, and here we have a correction in this paragraph with Ähnlichkeit, and then we have ähnlich, and this is the last deutlich we see. So that's the moment that Dedekind decided to change the terminology, and then he went back to his second paragraph to change everything. I think that making similar mapping the paragraph of its own was not a decision that he made at this point, because in the next paragraph, he makes a reference to the English mapping with the number paragraph 2, but in the next one, he has paragraph 2a. So I have a little summary of everything I just said. So we have the definition of the mapping, then the properties 15 to 17, we mentioned that the converse will be given later. Then we have the definition of the distinct mapping, the mapping of a system in itself, the finite and the infinite. Then we have the properties 15 star to 70 star, and a few other properties on distinct mappings. Then we have the sequence of natural numbers. We have the change of terminology and probably the additional properties of similar mapping. Then we have the correction of the definition of the sequence of natural numbers with the introduction of the simply infinite system. Then we have paragraph 6, sorry. And then we have the decision to make the paragraph on similar mapping become an independent paragraph. And I can stop here. Yeah.